In October of 1873, a decision was announced in the rural lowlands of Missouri that unsettled even men who had survived war without blinking. Emma Richter, a 17-year-old enslaved girl owned on paper by the Richter estate but controlled in practice by no one, was to be transferred from plantation custody into the authority of a privately funded medical committee. 6 physicians signed the order. 19 examinations were scheduled. 41 witnesses were invited. 11 weeks were allotted. The announcement was posted on the courthouse door at dawn, nailed crookedly as if the wood itself resisted. By sunset, every white household within 20 miles knew her name, Emma Richter. She had no recorded illness, no deformity, no visible abnormality. And yet, 3 separate doctors had sworn, under oath, that the girl exhibited physiological responses before stimulus occurred. Pain before pressure, shock before incision, recovery before injury. The White Society of Franklin County called it hysteria, trickery, or divine interference, depending on the speaker and the hour. Ministers debated her soul. Doctors debated her blood. Landowners debated her value. What none of them knew, what not one ledger, sermon, or medical journal would admit, was that by January of the following year, 3 men would be dead, 1 would be confined to an asylum, and every official record bearing Emma Richter's name would vanish. What truly happened inside that plantation house? What did Emma know before anyone told her? And why did grown men begin whispering when the girl entered the room? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The Richter plantation sat low against the Missouri River, where fog settled thick as breath and the soil clung to boots like a second skin. Autumn arrived early that year. Cornfields browned overnight. Wind worried the trees until they groaned like tired men. The war had ended 8 years earlier, but the land still behaved as if it were waiting for permission to heal. Technically, Missouri was a free state. In practice, chains had simply changed shape. Emma had lived on the Richter property since birth. No one remembered her first cry because there hadn't been one. She was delivered during a flood that split the riverbanks and carried half the midwife's tools downstream. Her mother, a woman named Latte, bled quietly through the night and died just before dawn. When they lifted the infant from her body, she opened her eyes and stared, not wailing, not gasping, just watching. "She looks like she already knows something," the midwife muttered. The women never forgot that. Emma grew tall and narrow, her movements economical, her gaze unsettlingly direct. She did her work without complaint, without praise-seeking, without error. She did not sing with the others, did not whisper during prayer. When asked a question, she answered plainly, or not at all. What unsettled people most was not her silence, but her timing. She stepped aside seconds before a beam collapsed. She brought water before a man asked for it. Once, she pressed a cloth to a child's forehead and said, "He will burn by nightfall," and the fever came exactly as spoken. No one punished her for these things. No one rewarded her either. They simply began watching. By the summer of 1873, Dr. Alistair Boone arrived unannounced, his carriage spattering mud against the main house. Boone was a man whose reputation traveled faster than his voice. A physician educated back east, known for cataloging anomalies with religious precision. He did not believe in miracles. He believed in patterns. He first saw Emma standing in the shade of the smokehouse, hands folded, eyes lifted toward nothing visible. "How old is the girl?" Boone asked. 17, the overseer replied. Emma spoke before either expected it. 17 years, 4 months, 9 days. Boone smiled thinly. Noted. The first examination was informal. A pulse check. Eye response. Reflexes. Emma complied without resistance. Boone applied pressure to her forearm, light, then firm. Emma flinched before his fingers tightened. He paused. Again he approached slowly. Again her body reacted seconds too early. Boone felt something shift behind his ribs. Interest sharpened by discomfort. "Pain threshold anomaly," he murmured. Emma met his eyes. "You haven't pressed yet." The room went still. That night, Boone wrote for 3 hours by lamplight. 2 days later, Reverend Hale visited the plantation. A week after that, Elias Moore arrived with ledgers already ruled. By September, the committee existed. They converted the east wing of the Richter house into a medical suite. White sheets, glass instruments, locking doors. Emma was relocated without ceremony. No chains were used. They found she walked more obediently without them. On the first official day of observation, 41 witnesses crowded the room. Doctors in stiff coats. Clergymen with folded hands. Two landowners curious about returns on investment. Emma was seated at the center. Dr. Boone lifted a needle. Emma spoke softly. It will hurt on the third breath. Boone hesitated, then proceeded. On the third breath she cried out. The sound did not match the injury. It was deeper, older, as if it had been waiting. None of them noticed the way Emma's fingers curled, not in fear but in counting. What Boone did not know was that Emma had already seen this room before. What none of them knew was that the pattern had already begun, and it would not stop for any of them. 3 weeks passed and the committee settled into routine, the most dangerous thing men like them could do. Morning examinations, afternoon debates, evening notes written in careful, slanted script that pretended calm where none existed. Emma was weighed, measured, tapped, pricked, and observed as though observation itself were harmless. They spoke over her head as if she were furniture. She listened as if time itself were speaking. Dr. Boone insisted on order. We will proceed systematically. No speculation. No superstition. Reverend Hale nodded each time the word systematic was spoken, as if it were prayer. Elias Moore recorded everything that could be counted: heartbeats per minute, seconds between stimulus and response, recovery intervals that made no sense when written side by side. Emma's body did not behave like a body was supposed to. When ice touched her skin, gooseflesh rose before contact. When a pin approached her fingertip, her pulse spiked in advance. When pressure was applied, her breath shortened early as though warned. It is anticipation, Moore argued one afternoon. Conditioning, said another. Fraud, muttered a third, though no one could explain how. Emma sat quietly, ankles crossed, wrists loose in her lap. She watched Boone's left hand shake when he believed no one noticed. On the 10th day, Boone leaned close. You are not afraid. Emma considered him. I am aware. He straightened. Awareness could be recorded. Fear complicated ledgers. They began isolating variables. Soundproofing the room. Altering lighting. Changing examiners without notice. Emma's responses adjusted every time, never lagging, never misaligned. One afternoon, Boone whispered to Moore without looking up. She is responding to something beyond sensory input. Moore hesitated before writing. Divine? No, Boone said. Temporal. The word lingered between them. That night, the Richter plantation slept uneasily. Wind rattled shutters. Dogs refused to settle. Emma lay awake on a narrow cot, eyes open in the dark. She counted breaths that were not her own. She listened to footsteps that had not yet reached the stairs. What none of them knew was that Emma had begun mapping them, not their bodies but their endings. The first crack appeared during a routine reflex test. Dr. Samuel Price, a junior member, laughed nervously as he approached Emma with a rubber mallet. You know this will not hurt, he said, attempting kindness. Emma looked at him. You will drop it. Price smiled. I will not. His fingers went slack. The mallet struck the floor. Silence spread. Price bent to retrieve it, face flushed. Coincidence. Emma spoke again, softer. You should not stand so close to the window. He ignored her. Minutes later, a gust tore through the room. The sash slammed shut, shattering glass inward. A shard cut Price's cheek from eye to jaw. Blood dotted the white floor. Boone ordered the room cleared. Hale prayed. Moore wrote faster than his hand could keep up. Emma did not move. After that, guards were stationed outside her door, not for her protection but theirs. Rumors leaked. In town, people whispered of witchcraft, of curses that survived emancipation. The committee dismissed it publicly, but privately, sleep became difficult. Men woke with names on their lips they did not recognize. On the 19th examination, Emma broke her silence without being addressed. Dr. Price will not return. Boone's head snapped up. He is recovering. Emma shook her head. No. 3 days later, Price collapsed at his breakfast table, blood pooling beneath his nose, his body folding inward as if pulled by invisible hands. The diagnosis was swift and unsatisfying: aneurysm. Sudden. Unpredictable. Emma had said it first. Boone locked the doors. We continue, he ordered. We do not stop. Reverend Hale objected. This is no longer study. This is temptation. Boone turned on him. Do not cloak fear in scripture. Emma listened from her chair. She traced a crack in the floor with her toe. What Boone did not know was that the decision to continue had already cost him more than he could imagine. They intensified the sessions. Sleep deprivation. Extended observation. Lights kept burning through the night. Emma's body weakened, but her awareness sharpened. She began speaking between tests, naming small things. The candle will gutter. The ledger page will tear. You will forget that word. Each time she was correct. More stopped meeting her eyes. On the 26th day, Emma finally asked a question of her own. Why do you write only what you understand? Boone stiffened. That is the nature of science. Emma nodded. Then you will never finish. The words unsettled him more than any prediction. Outside, autumn deepened. Leaves rotted where they fell. The river swelled and receded, indifferent. Inside the plantation house, the air grew stale with fear disguised as curiosity. None of them knew how close they were to the point of no return. Emma did, and she was counting down. By the 4th week, the committee stopped pretending this was an experiment. They no longer debated theories in the open. Doors were closed. Voices lowered. When they spoke Emma's name, it carried weight now, like a condition or a warning. Dr. Boone arrived earlier each morning, his coat unbuttoned, his hair losing its careful order. Sleep clung to him like illness. He dreamed of rooms without doors and clocks with no hands. Each time he woke, the same thought pressed against his skull. She is ahead of us. Emma noticed the change before anyone admitted it. You are tired, she said as Boone approached with a stethoscope. I am observant, he replied sharply. She tilted her head. You will not be tomorrow. Boone froze. The room held its breath. Moore cleared his throat. Proceed. The stethoscope never touched her chest. Boone's hand hovered, trembling, then withdrew. He made a note that meant nothing. After Dr. Price's death, the townspeople grew restless. Women crossed the street when committee members passed. Children were called indoors early. Someone painted a crude symbol on the Richter fence, scratched away before dawn but remembered by those who saw it. Inside the house, the atmosphere curdled. Reverend Hale refused to enter the examination room alone. There are forces here we were not meant to interrogate. Boone's response was cold. God does not object to being studied. Emma watched Hale's jaw tighten. She spoke before the argument could harden. You will leave soon, she told the Reverend. Not by choice. Hale turned pale. I will not indulge this. He left the room and did not return that day. That evening, Emma asked for water. The guard hesitated, then complied. When he handed her the cup, his fingers brushed hers. He recoiled as if burned. You should write to your wife, Emma said gently. The guard laughed, uneasy. She is dead. Emma nodded. I know. That night, Hale packed his things. He told Boone he was returning to St. Louis for counsel. Boone did not argue. By dawn, Hale was gone. His carriage found overturned on a narrow stretch of road, his neck broken against stone. The horses returned alone. 2 deaths. The committee reconvened in silence. Moore's handwriting deteriorated. Pages smudged. Numbers crossed out and rewritten until they lost meaning. On the margin of one page, he scribbled a question and scratched it out. Is she causing this? Emma was thinner now. Shadows nested beneath her eyes. Still, her voice never wavered. On the 31st day, she spoke a name none of them expected. Elias Moore. Moore flinched. You should stop writing, she continued. You will not like what comes next. Boone stood abruptly. You will not threaten my colleagues. Emma looked up at him. I am not threatening. I am informing. Moore's chair scraped loudly as he stood. This is absurd. His hand shook so badly he dropped his pen. Emma watched it roll away. You will dream of water tonight, she said. You will wake choking. Moore fled the room. Boone ordered the session terminated early. Guards escorted Emma back to her quarters. She walked slowly, carefully, as if conserving something precious. What Boone did not know was that Emma had already seen the night unfold. Every step, every sound, every consequence. Moore did not sleep. He sat upright, staring at the door until dawn. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his dream came fast and deep. He thrashed, gasping, clawing at his throat as if submerged. They found him in the morning, alive but ruined. Eyes unfocused, words tangled. He screamed at reflections and begged unseen figures for time. The doctor's report was brief: nervous collapse. Permanent. 3 men lost. The committee fractured. Boone insisted on control. She is not the cause. She is the lens. No one argued. They increased restrictions. Food reduced. Light removed. Silence enforced. Emma endured without protest. She conserved energy. She waited. One night, Boone broke protocol. He entered her room alone, lantern low. Tell me how you do it. Emma did not look at him. You would not accept the answer. I am prepared, he said, though his voice betrayed him. She turned then, eyes steady, ancient. You study the body, she said. I listen to time. Boone felt something collapse inside his chest. Not belief, but certainty. Outside, winter crept closer. Frost kissed the windows. The plantation house groaned as if aware of what it sheltered. None of them understood that they were no longer in control. Emma did. And the next name was already forming. By the time frost sealed the ground, Dr. Boone accepted what he would never say aloud. The pattern was not random, and it was not slowing. He convened the remaining members in the west parlor, curtains drawn, fire low. Only 4 chairs were filled now. Where 6 men once argued, silence sat heavy, crowded with absence. She cannot be allowed to continue influencing outcomes, Boone said carefully. No one asked what he meant by influencing. They had abandoned that argument weeks ago. A younger physician spoke at last. We remove stimulus entirely. Isolation. No contact. Reverend Hale would have objected. Elias Moore would have written a note. Neither was there. Emma was moved to the cellar room beneath the east wing, stone walls, one narrow window near the ceiling, light filtered through iron bars. No clocks. No visitors. Meals slid through a slot twice a day. They told themselves this was control. Emma sat on the floor, knees drawn in, listening. Above her, footsteps paced. Doors opened and closed. Candles guttered. Voices argued in hushed tones that carried through the floorboards like echoes of distant thunder. She counted heartbeats she could not hear. She measured days without seeing the sun. What none of them knew was that isolation did not blind her. It sharpened her. On the second night below, a guard named Thomas lingered too long at the door. He was young, newly hired, still convinced obedience could protect him. You need anything? He asked softly. Emma lifted her head. You should not be here. He smiled nervously. I am assigned. She studied his face as if committing it to memory. You will forget your rifle tomorrow. He laughed and left. The next morning, Boone stormed through the corridor, furious. A rifle is missing. Thomas stood pale, hands empty, unable to explain how he had left it leaning by the door and returned to find it gone. They searched for hours. It was never found. Emma listened as voices passed overhead. On the 4th day, Boone descended the cellar steps alone. He carried no instruments, only a chair. He sat opposite Emma, close enough to see how thin she had become, how her hands trembled faintly when she breathed. You are weakening, he said. Emma nodded. Yes. Good, Boone replied, though the word tasted wrong. He leaned forward. If you are listening to time as you claim, then tell me this. Does it listen back? Emma's eyes lifted to his. Sometimes. His mouth went dry. You will not frighten me with riddles. She did not smile. You will die on a Wednesday. Boone stood so abruptly the chair fell backward. That is enough. He left without another word. That night, snow fell early. Heavy. Soundless. It muffled the plantation until even the dogs quieted. Emma lay awake. She felt the shift before it happened. The subtle tightening, the way the air seemed to draw inward. Above her, a man screamed. The sound cut off too quickly. They found the body at dawn. One of the physicians slipped on the cellar steps, neck twisted at an angle that allowed no correction. An accident. A tragedy. A Wednesday. Boone locked himself in his office and burned 3 pages of notes. The committee dissolved in everything but name. One man resigned outright. Another fled town without explanation. Boone remained because he could not imagine leaving the pattern unfinished. Emma was returned to the examination room, thinner, quieter, more distant than before. Boone spoke with forced calm. You will tell me everything. Emma looked past him toward the window. It is already ending. He slammed his hand against the table. No, you do not decide that. She met his gaze. You decided when you stopped listening. Something inside Boone cracked. Not fear, not belief, but pride. We escalate, he said to the others. Full stress response. If there is fraud, it will reveal itself. The tests resumed with cruelty disguised as rigor. Bright lights. Cold exposure. Prolonged restraint. Emma's body shook, but her eyes remained clear. During one session, she whispered, barely audible, You are making this worse. Boone ignored her. By the 6th hour, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He ordered the session ended. That night, Boone dreamed of clocks melting into the floor, of names etched into skin. He woke gasping, convinced he had missed something vital. Down the hall, Emma sat upright, staring into the dark. She had spoken 4 names now. Only one remained, and it belonged to the man who believed himself immune. The house creaked as if in warning. None of them knew how little time was left. Emma did. She always had. The Richter house did not sleep anymore. It waited. Floorboards groaned under their own memory. Doors sighed even when untouched. Every man left inside the house felt as though he were trespassing on something older than ownership, older than law. Dr. Boone moved through the corridors like a man rehearsing his own defense. He avoided mirrors. He avoided Emma's eyes. He avoided Wednesdays. He told himself the deaths were coincidence, pressure, weak constitutions exposed by stress. Men broke every day. Science did not bend to superstition. And yet, on the 49th day, Boone discovered that time itself had betrayed him. He was reviewing notes when he noticed the margins first. Dates written in his own hand that he did not remember recording. Predictions buried between measurements. Symptom escalation imminent. Subject response precedes stimulus. Terminal outcome probable. Boone flipped pages faster. His pulse quickened. On the final page, written neatly at the bottom, was a sentence he had never authored. Wednesday. He closed the ledger slowly. What Boone did not know was that Emma had already seen this moment. Him alone, lamplight trembling, the words staring back at him like an accusation. That afternoon she refused food for the first time. The guard hesitated. She has not eaten. Leave it, Boone said. We continue as planned. Emma sat motionless as the tray was removed. Her breathing slowed, deliberate, measured. You are starving yourself, Boone said later, attempting authority. Emma shook her head. I am conserving. For what? She met his gaze. You will understand soon. That evening, snow began again, thick and relentless. It pressed against the windows as if seeking entry. The guards huddled closer to the fire. One man crossed himself repeatedly, though no one asked why. At precisely 9 minutes past midnight, the east wing lantern went out. A guard swore softly. I will relight it. He did not return. They found him slumped at the base of the stairs, eyes wide, breath shallow, alive but unresponsive. No wound. No explanation. Panic spread. Boone ordered the record secured. Everything. Lock it away. But fear does not follow orders. A junior clerk, hands shaking, dropped a stack of files near the hearth. Pages scattered. Ink smudged. Someone cursed. The fire caught faster than expected. At first it was only a corner. Then a sheet. Then a curl of smoke that turned black and thick. Put it out. Boone shouted. Too late. Flames climbed greedily, devouring months of notes. Pulse rates, diagrams, conclusions that now meant nothing. Men scrambled, coughing, eyes stinging. One tripped. Another screamed. Emma felt the heat through the walls. She stood. The guards outside her room hesitated as she approached the door. She did not ask permission. You should leave, she said. One man dropped his keys. By the time Boone realized Emma was no longer confined, she was already standing at the threshold of the burning room, firelight dancing across her face. Get her out, someone shouted. Emma did not move. She looked at Boone across the chaos. Smoke framed him like a shroud. This was never about answers, she said calmly. It was about control. Boone coughed, rage and terror twisting his features. You are nothing without us. Emma stepped forward. You were nothing before me. A beam cracked overhead. Men scattered. Someone dragged Boone backward as the ceiling collapsed in sparks and ash. When the fire was finally contained, the records were gone. So was Emma. They searched the house, the grounds, the riverbank. Snow erased footprints as quickly as they formed. At dawn, Boone stood alone in the ruined room, staring at blackened walls. Wednesday. He laughed once, sharp and broken. She planned this, he whispered. What Boone did not know, what he would never know, was that Emma had not planned escape. She had simply reached the moment where she no longer needed to remain. 2 days later, Boone boarded a train east, abandoning the plantation, the committee, the ruins of his certainty. He did not make it past the 3rd station. The official report cited heart failure. Those who had heard Emma's voice knew better. Years later, people would claim to see a young woman walking along the river at dusk, counting softly under her breath. Some said she healed. Others said she warned. Science dismissed it all. History erased her name. But time did not. And somewhere between the moments that pass and the moments that wait, Emma Richter was still listening. By the time the sun rose over Franklin County, the Richter house looked like a mouth that had swallowed its own tongue, blackened beams, damp smoke clinging to the siding, windows filmed with soot. Men stood in the yard with frost in their beards and blame on their lips, trying to decide which story would keep them safest. In town, the rumor arrived before the facts. A fire, the shopkeeper said, voice too loud. A girl, whispered a woman at the well. A curse, muttered the man who had once sold bodies and now sold sermons. The sheriff rode out just after noon, flanked by 2 deputies and a minister who did not belong to the committee but wanted to appear useful. They walked the ruined east wing, stepped over ash that had once been paper, and asked the only question that mattered. Where is the girl? No one answered quickly. Guards exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. She ran. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. A 17-year-old ran in this snow with no coat, no horse, no money. She was unusual, the guard offered and regretted it immediately. The sheriff paused at the edge of the charred room. He poked at the debris with the tip of his boot, dislodging a curled corner of ledger that crumbled into dust. What were you doing here? He asked. Dr. Boone was not present to reply. He had left before dawn, face gray, hands shaking, coat thrown on as if he meant to outrun the house itself. What Boone did not know was that his departure had already been written into someone else's schedule. One of the committee men, Dr. Whitcomb, the last remaining physician besides Boone, answered carefully. Medical observation. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment. On a slave. She is property, Whitcomb said, then flinched at his own words. The war had ended, but language lagged behind law. The minister with the sheriff stepped forward. This is a matter for Christian mercy. The girl may be frightened. Perhaps she. Whitcomb cut him off, voice brittle. She predicted deaths. The yard went quiet. The sheriff's eyes sharpened. How many? Whitcomb's throat worked. 2. And then. More. And then. He stopped before the number could become confession. The sheriff took a step closer. You will tell me exactly what happened. Whitcomb looked toward the house as if it might answer for him. It does not fit in words. None of them said the name Emma Richter aloud. It felt like lighting a match. That night, Boone sat alone in a second-class train car, traveling east with a valise full of ash-smelling clothes and a mind that would not stop replaying the same image. Emma standing in firelight, eyes steady, voice calm. You were nothing before me. Across the aisle, an elderly woman watched him with polite distance. She saw a man sweating in winter, hands clenched as if gripping an invisible railing. You are ill, she said. I am tired, Boone replied without looking up. The woman studied him another moment. Tired men do not shake like that. Boone's jaw tightened. Mind your business. The woman lowered her gaze, but she whispered a phrase under her breath, half prayer, half warning. Boone did not hear it clearly. He only felt the air change the way it had changed before Price's death, before Hale's carriage flipped, before Moore's mind unraveled. A tightening. A pulling. He looked toward the window. Snow streaked past like white knives. Wednesday. He had tried not to count. He had failed. At the 3rd station, Boone stepped down onto the platform to breathe. The air cut sharp. He leaned against a post, chest heaving. The station master glanced at him and then away as if illness were contagious. Boone pressed a hand to his sternum. Pain bloomed, sudden, deep, irrational. He laughed once, thin and disbelieving. No, he whispered. Not like this. A man nearby turned. Sir? Boone tried to answer. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. His vision narrowed, the platform tilting, the world tugging him downward. He fell to his knees. The station master shouted. Someone ran. The elderly woman from the train appeared at the edge of the crowd, face solemn, not surprised. Boone looked up at her, desperate. Help me. The woman shook her head slowly. You already met the one who warns. Boone's eyes widened. She did this. The woman's expression did not change. She told you what was coming. You called it superstition. Boone's breath rattled. His hand clawed at the post as if he could hold himself in time. Then his fingers slipped. When he collapsed onto the frozen boards, a final sound escaped him, half sob, half laugh, because in the last instant, he understood the cruelty of it. The thing he had chased was not knowledge. It was consequence. The official report that arrived in Franklin County 3 days later was written in tidy, comforting language. Heart failure aggravated by stress, no suspicion of foul play. The sheriff accepted it with relief, because anything else would have required action, and action would have required admitting what the committee had been doing to a girl in their custody. Dr. Whitcomb burned the remaining fragments of notes that had survived the fire. He did it in his own hearth, watching pages curl and darken. His wife stood behind him, arms folded tight. What was on those papers? Whitcomb swallowed. A mistake. What kind? He stared into the flame. The kind that learns your name. After Boone's death, the Richter plantation was sold quietly. The new owner tore out the east wing entirely, rebuilt it larger, brighter, as if square footage could exorcise memory. The cellar room where Emma had been kept was filled with stone and mortar until it no longer existed. But the town did not forget. Children began whispering that if you walked by the river at dusk, you could hear counting. Not chanting. Not singing. Counting, slow, patient, as though someone was measuring the space between heartbeats. A boy swore he saw a girl in the reeds, thin as smoke, eyes like still water. When he blinked, she was gone. His mother slapped him for speaking of it. "Do not invite that," she hissed. Years later, historians would search county archives for Emma Richter and find nothing but gaps. No birth record, no death certificate, no emancipation paper. It was as if the girl had existed only in the nervous pauses of old men and the way certain women locked their doors before nightfall. And yet, the strangest part was this. For decades afterward, every time a doctor arrived in Franklin County to study some anomaly, some illness, some curious case, something small went wrong. A lantern went out. A ledger tore. A horse refused to cross a certain stretch of road. As if time itself remembered the girl they had tried to measure. And as if somewhere, unheard but not absent, Emma Richter was still listening, waiting for the next person to mistake her warning for permission. In the spring of 1891, long after Boone's name had dried into the footnotes of forgotten journals, a man named Charles Dempsey arrived in Franklin County with a carpetbag and a scholar's arrogance. He was not a doctor, not a preacher, not a lawman. He called himself an archivist, one of those men who believed truth could be arranged neatly if you gathered enough paper and stared at it long enough. Dempsey had been hired by a university in St. Louis to catalog county records before mold, fire, and politics erased them entirely. He expected land deeds, marriage certificates, war pensions. He did not expect fear. The courthouse clerk was an old woman with sharp eyes and hands stained by ink. She watched Dempsey unpack his tools as if she were watching someone lay out knives. "You are late," she said. Dempsey smiled politely. "Late for what?" The clerk did not answer. She slid a stack of boxes across the desk. "Start there," she said, and her voice held the same tone people used when pointing someone toward a grave they did not want to discuss. For 3 days, Dempsey worked without incident. Dust choked him. Paper cut his fingertips. He made tidy lists and felt pleased with himself. On the 4th day, he found the gap. It was not one missing page. It was a missing season. October 1873 to February 1874, county records thinned to almost nothing. No court filings. No property disputes. No prison logs. A silence so unnatural it felt deliberate. Dempsey frowned and asked the clerk, "Where are the winter records?" The clerk's eyes flicked toward the window as if checking the weather. "Lost," she said. "Lost how?" The clerk's jaw tightened. "Fire. Flood. Rats. Men. Pick one." Dempsey laughed softly, thinking she was being theatrical. "Records do not vanish in 4 months without a reason." The clerk leaned forward. "Then perhaps you should stop digging for reasons." He stared at her, surprised. "Madam, it is my work." The clerk's voice lowered. So was theirs. Dempsey opened his mouth to ask who theirs meant, but she turned away, ending the conversation like a slammed door. That night, he rented a room above the general store. Rain tapped the window. The town settled into darkness early. Dempsey lit a lamp and spread his notes across the bed, reorganizing dates, tracing absences. He told himself it was simple negligence, a clerk's mistake, a county's laziness. Then he noticed something he had not written. On the corner of his own page, in ink darker than his, was a mark, 3 small strokes like tally marks. He froze. He checked his pen, checked his bottle. The ink in his tools was lighter, browner with age. His lamp flickered. A board creaked in the hallway. Dempsey held his breath, listening. No footsteps followed. The creak came again, closer, as if someone had shifted their weight outside his door. He stood and opened it. The hallway was empty. When he returned to the room, the tally marks had multiplied. 6 now. His throat tightened. He snatched the paper and rubbed at the ink until the fibers began to tear. In the morning, he went back to the courthouse and demanded access to the Richter property deed files. The clerk watched him steadily. "You do not want that." Dempsey's pride flared. "I did not travel here to be warned off by superstition." The clerk's expression did not change. "Superstition is what people call it when the truth makes them uncomfortable." She stood, shuffled to the far cabinet, and withdrew a thin folder. She set it on the desk with reluctance, as though handing him something that might bite. "Read fast," she said. Then put it back where it belongs. Inside were deeds, transfer forms, one crude map, and a single torn page of ledger paper, blackened at one edge. The handwriting was precise. Dempsey's eyes scanned the lines. His pulse climbed. Notations of examinations. Witnesses. Response intervals. The language of science attempting to cage what it did not understand. At the bottom, smudged but legible, was a name. Emma Richter. Dempsey felt the room tilt slightly, as if the building itself had shifted in recognition. He looked up. The clerk was watching him with something like pity. "You see," she said quietly. "Now you know why the winter went missing." Dempsey swallowed. Where did she go? The clerk's lips pressed together. Gone. That is not an answer. It is the only one you will get, the clerk replied. People asked after her for years. Some said she drowned. Some said she walked into the river like it was a doorway. Some said she was taken north. Some said she was never real to begin with. Dempsey's fingers tightened on the torn page. And what do you say? The clerk hesitated, then leaned in. I say she was real enough to scare educated men into burning their own proof. The words struck him like a slap because they were too sharp to be rumor. Dempsey returned to his rented room that night with the torn page hidden under his coat. He told himself he would copy it, preserve it, send it to the university. He told himself he was rescuing history. He laid the page on the desk and lit the lamp. The tally marks were already there. Not on his notes this time. On the ledger fragment itself. 9 strokes now, pressed into the paper as if someone had counted directly through the years. Dempsey's mouth went dry. His hands hovered above the page, unwilling to touch it. A sound came from the window, soft, rhythmic. Not rain. Knuckles. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. Dempsey's heart hammered. He crossed the room and pulled back the curtain. No one stood outside. Only the dark street and the river fog creeping between buildings like breath searching for lungs. Then, faintly, so faintly he wondered if it was only his fear-shaping sound, he heard it. Counting. Slow. Patient. Certain. 1, 2, 3. Dempsey stumbled backward, knocking the lamp. It toppled. Oil spilled. Flame caught instantly. He slapped at it, frantic, but fire climbed the curtains like hunger. The ledger fragment curled at the edges, blackening, disappearing into smoke. Dempsey screamed, not from pain, but from the sick understanding that he had just repeated the county's oldest ritual. Erased the evidence. When the fire was out and the room was ruined, Dempsey sat on the floor shaking, staring at ash. The next morning, he left Franklin County without collecting his pay. He never wrote his report. And in St. Louis, when the university asked why, he gave the only answer that sounded sane. Some records want to stay buried. But deep down, he knew the truth was stranger than that. Somewhere in the spaces between seconds, Emma Richter was still counting. Not to frighten them. To measure how many times men would try to own what was never theirs. After Charles Dempsey fled Franklin County, the town settled back into its habits with the relief of people who believed they had outrun something by refusing to name it. The general store reopened. Church bells rang on schedule. Children were sent to school with clean faces and rehearsed silence. The Richter property passed through 2 more owners, each convinced that fresh paint and wider windows could overwrite memory. They spoke of progress. They spoke of moving on. They did not speak of October 1873. But absence has weight. And silence, when pressed long enough, begins to speak. Old men woke in the night convinced they had heard a girl's voice counting from the corner of the room. Women refused to hang laundry near the river because the air there felt watched. Midwives began recording unusual births. Children who did not cry, children who stared too long, children who flinched before being touched. Doctors dismissed it all as coincidence. They always did. In 1904, a young physician named Henry Walsh arrived from Chicago to take up practice in the county. He was ambitious, polite, and eager to prove himself. He believed deeply in modern medicine, in microscopes and charts, and the promise that science would soon explain everything worth explaining. Within a month, he noticed the pattern. Patients describing pain before injury. Fevers predicted hours in advance. One woman insisted she could feel her husband's death approaching, like a tightening rope. And when Walsh laughed, she wept, not because he mocked her, but because she knew he would remember the moment later. Walsh began keeping a private notebook. Not official records. Just observations. Margins filled with questions. He never wrote a name. On a cold evening in December, Walsh was called to a farmhouse near the river. A boy lay shivering, skin pale, breath shallow. The mother hovered, hands clasped tight enough to bruise. He said it would happen tonight, she whispered. Walsh frowned. Who said? The woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the dark. A girl, she said. He dreamed of her. Walsh examined the child, found the signs of infection, prescribed what he could. As he packed his bag, he felt the familiar tightening, the sensation he could never quite explain, like stepping into a room where something had just been said about you. Your son will recover, he said, attempting reassurance. The woman nodded slowly. I know. That night, Walsh dreamed of counting. He woke with the number 6 on his lips and no memory of why. By spring, he stopped writing in his notebook. He tore out pages. He burned them in his stove, watching words blacken into nothing. He told himself he was being prudent. He told himself some things did not need recording. What Walsh did not know was that restraint would not save him. In June, he was called again to the river road. A man had collapsed, clutching his chest, breath gone in seconds. Walsh arrived too late to help. As he knelt beside the body, the dead man's wife looked up at him with red, steady eyes. She warned us, the woman said. Walsh swallowed. Who? The woman's mouth tightened. The girl who listens. Walsh stood, heart racing. There is no girl. The woman's gaze did not waver. Then why do you look like you hear her too? Walsh left town within the year. The notebook he abandoned was found decades later in the attic of the rented house, its remaining pages filled with a single repeated phrase, written smaller and smaller until the ink tore the paper. I should have listened. By the 1920s, Franklin County's story hardened into folklore. Newspapers printed sanitized accounts of a mysterious fire, of an unfortunate doctor's death, of records lost to time. College students wrote papers about regional hysteria. Professors graded them generously, pleased by explanations that required no reckoning. But folklore has a way of preserving truth where archives fail. Stories persisted of a girl seen at dusk by the river, counting softly, never aging. Of men who tried to study her and never finished their work. Of ledgers that caught fire without flame. Parents warned their children. Do not stare at what you do not understand. Do not try to own what listens back. No one said Emma Richter's name anymore. Names have power, and the town had learned caution. Yet even without her name, the pattern endured. In 1947, a flood uncovered part of the old Richter cellar foundation, stones long buried, mortar crumbling. Workers unearthed a rusted key and a length of chain fused into the rock as if grown there. The items were quietly reburied. The men who found them did not speak of it. One of them began waking each night at the same hour, convinced he was late for something. He died years later with the clock stopped beside his bed. Historians would later argue that Emma Richter was an invention, a composite of fears, a symbol mistaken for a person. They would point to the lack of documents, the impossibility of claims. They would miss the obvious. Erasure is not absence. It is effort. Someone had worked very hard to make Emma disappear. Someone had burned paper, sealed rooms, closed mouths. And still, she remained, in consequences, in timing, in the way certain men learned too late that knowledge without humility carries a cost. Time passed. Generations turned. And if you stood by the river at dusk, when fog softened the world and the air grew thick with listening, you might still hear it, not threatening, not cruel. Counting. Measuring. Waiting. Not for belief. For the next person who would mistake warning for invitation. And when that happened, as it always did, Emma Richter would already know. In August of 1962, when the heat sat over Missouri like a wet blanket and cicadas screamed from the tree line as if the world were on fire, a graduate student named Margaret Lyle arrived in Franklin County with a government grant and the clean confidence of youth. She came for Reconstruction-era land disputes. That was what her paperwork said. That was what she told the motel clerk when he asked why anyone would choose to spend a summer in a town that looked half asleep even at noon. I'm doing research, she said. The clerk's expression tightened in a way she did not understand. Research on what year? 1870s, Margaret replied. The clerk's eyes shifted away from her face, toward the window, toward the river fog even in daylight. Try not to stay out late. Margaret smiled, assuming it was hospitality in a rough disguise. I won't. She did not know that people in Franklin County gave warnings the way they handed down heirlooms, quietly, without explanations because explanations were invitations. Margaret spent her mornings at the courthouse and her afternoons at the County Historical Society, a brick building with a peeling sign and an interior that smelled of old glue and slow decay. A volunteer named Mrs. Kessler guided her through shelves of binders and boxes. Most of the winter records are thin, Mrs. Kessler said, as if discussing weather patterns. 1873 to 1874 especially. Margaret's pen paused. Why? Mrs. Kessler shrugged. Fire. Folks back then were careless. Margaret had heard that word before. Careless. She wrote it down anyway, though it did not satisfy her. On her sixth day, in the back room where archives sat stacked like forgotten coffins, she noticed a box set apart from the rest. No label. No catalog number. Just brown cardboard and twine that looked newer than the dust around it. Is that one processed? Margaret asked. Mrs. Kessler's hand stopped mid-reach. Her face changed in a way that made the room feel suddenly colder. That box is not for visitors, she said. Margaret blinked. Why not? Mrs. Kessler hesitated, then forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. It's private donations. Family papers. Not organized. Margaret's curiosity sharpened. I can organize it. Mrs. Kessler's fingers tightened on the edge of a shelf. You should not. Margaret laughed softly, unintentionally disrespectful. Mrs. Kessler, I've spent 3 years reading handwriting that looks like spider legs. I'll be fine. The older woman stared at her for a long moment, and in that stare Margaret felt something she could not name. Fear, yes, but also a weary sort of resignation, as if the warning had been given and what happened next was no longer the giver's burden. All right, Mrs. Kessler said finally, but you do it in here. And you put everything back exactly the way you found it. Margaret nodded too quickly. She pulled the box toward her table and untied the twine. The lid lifted with a faint sigh, like a sealed room exhaling. Inside were loose papers, mostly receipts and household notes, the ordinary bones of ordinary lives. Then beneath them a small cloth pouch. Margaret opened it and felt her stomach tighten. A thin ledger fragment lay inside, charred at one corner, edges brittle, ink dark and stubborn against the damage. At the top, a date, October 1873. Beneath it, a heading, Committee Observations. Margaret's breath slowed. She read. Pulse intervals. Response times. Witness lists. And then, halfway down the page, a name that seemed to pull the air out of the room. Emma Richter. Margaret swallowed. She had never heard the name. Not in her coursework, not in published county histories, not in the sanitized pamphlet the Historical Society sold tourists. And yet the handwriting was calm, clinical, unmistakably real. She turned the page fragment over. There, written in a different hand, Messier urgent, was a sentence that did not belong in a medical record. If you are reading this, do not take her for a specimen. She is not an object. She is a measure. Margaret's pulse quickened. She glanced toward Mrs. Kessler, who stood near the doorway, watching with a face that had gone pale. What is this? Margaret asked. Mrs. Kessler did not answer at first. She stepped into the room as if stepping into a church. My grandmother told me there was a girl, she said quietly. She said the men who tried to study her burned their own proof. Margaret's mouth went dry. You believe that? Mrs. Kessler's eyes flicked to the ledger fragment. I believe people do not hide nothing. They hide something. Margaret's fingers traced the ink carefully, reverent without intending it. There's more, she murmured, sifting through the papers. Beneath the pouch, she found an envelope sealed with wax, the seal broken long ago. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was steady, educated. Signed at the bottom with a name Margaret recognized from earlier courthouse documents. Elias Moore. Her stomach tightened again. The letter was not long. But each line felt heavy, as if written by a man who knew he would not be believed and did not care anymore. Moore described Emma's anticipation of pain. Her naming of deaths. The way the committee had begun whispering, then praying, then burning. He wrote of Boone's pride and Hale's terror. He wrote a single line that made Margaret's blood run cold. She told us we were not studying her. We were standing in her shadow. Margaret looked up sharply. Mrs. Kessler was staring at the window. What? Margaret asked. The older woman's voice was barely audible. It's getting late. Margaret glanced at her watch. It was only 5. The sun still sat high, bright and indifferent. There's time, Margaret said, though her voice sounded thinner now. Mrs. Kessler shook her head. In this town there isn't. Margaret gathered the papers, hands suddenly clumsy. I need to copy these. Photograph them. This is history. Mrs. Kessler's gaze snapped back to her. No, she said sharply. You read it. You learned. Now you put it back. Margaret's chest tightened. Why? Mrs. Kessler's face held something close to anger. Anger made from fear held too long. Because every time someone tries to take her out of the ground, something burns. As if on cue, the overhead light flickered once, then steadied. Margaret froze. She told herself it was old wiring. A storm in the distance. Nothing. Still, when she slid the ledger fragment back into its pouch, she noticed something she had not seen before. Along the margin, pressed into the paper as if written by an invisible hand, were tally marks. Not inked. Impressed. Like a fingernail pressed too hard into soft wood. Margaret counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Her throat tightened as the number climbed. When she reached 12, she stopped, because she realized there was space for more. And somewhere beyond the window, beyond the brick walls, beyond the respectable lies the county had practiced for nearly a century, the river fog began to rise, slowly, patiently, like breath searching for lungs. What Margaret did not know was that she had just become part of the record. And Emma Richter, wherever she existed now, in legend, in consequence, in the quiet machinery of time, had already heard her name. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay on the narrow motel bed, the box from the Historical Society replaying itself behind her eyes, the charred ledger fragment, the letter written by a man who knew his words would someday be buried, the tally marks pressed into paper like a quiet insistence. She told herself she was tired. She told herself the flickering light had been faulty wiring, the warning nothing more than inherited superstition. She told herself this town was like any other town that had survived by forgetting. At 3:02, she woke with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Her heart pounded as she sat upright, breath held, eyes straining against the dark. The room was empty. The air smelled faintly of river damp and old smoke, though the window was closed. She lay back down slowly. Then she heard it. Counting. Not aloud, not in sound exactly, but in rhythm. In the spaces between her breaths. In the pulse in her ears. 1, 2, 3. She pressed her hands over her ears. The counting did not stop. By morning, Margaret's certainty had hardened into something else. Not fear, but obligation. She showered, dressed, and returned to the Historical Society before it opened, waiting on the steps with her notebook clutched like a shield. Mrs. Kessler arrived just after 8. She stopped short when she saw Margaret. "I told you to put it back," the older woman said quietly. "I did," Margaret replied. "Exactly as I found it." Mrs. Kessler studied her face for signs of lying. She seemed to find something worse. "You should leave," she said. "Today." Margaret shook her head. "I can't." Mrs. Kessler's lips pressed thin. "Why?" "Because now I understand," Margaret said, though the words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. This wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't hysteria or folklore. It was an experiment that failed because it never understood its subject. Mrs. Kessler looked away. "That is what they all say at first." "Who?" Margaret asked. The older woman hesitated, then answered. "People who think writing it down will protect them." Margaret swallowed. "I'm not trying to own it. I'm trying to tell the truth." Mrs. Kessler turned back, eyes sharp. Truth is not always a release. The box was still where Margaret had left it. She opened it again, slower now, more careful. The tally marks were unchanged. Well, she exhaled, relief flickering. Then she noticed something else. In the corner of the ledger fragment, faint but undeniable, was a new impression. One short stroke, barely visible, as if testing the paper. 13. Margaret's stomach clenched. "I didn't do that," she whispered. Mrs. Kessler crossed herself. "She's counting you now." Margaret laughed weakly. "That's impossible." Mrs. Kessler's voice was steady. So was she. Against every warning, Margaret photographed the ledger fragment and the letter. She justified it as preservation, as scholarship. She told herself no one would be harmed by light. The camera shutter clicked 3 times. Outside, thunder rolled though the sky was clear. That evening, Margaret sat at the motel desk, spreading out her notes, organizing her argument. She would write carefully, respectfully. She would frame Emma Richter not as a miracle or a monster, but as evidence of how power reacts when confronted with what it cannot control. She began typing. The words came easily at first. Context, dates, names, the language of academia soothing her nerves. Then she reached the heart of it, the ledger, the letter, the pattern of deaths, and her fingers slowed. The cursor blinked. Her lamp flickered. Counting resumed. Faster now. She tried to ignore it, tried to push through, but the rhythm intruded, pressing against her thoughts until each sentence felt timed, measured. 1 paragraph per number. 1 breath per word. She stopped typing and stared at the screen. "What do you want?" she whispered, ashamed of herself for asking the empty room. The counting paused. Then, softly, not in sound but in understanding, came an answer she did not hear so much as receive. Do not explain me. Margaret's chest tightened. I'm not. Do not measure me. Her hand shook. Then what am I supposed to do? The answer came with the weight of inevitability. Listen. Margaret sat back, tears blurring her vision, because she understood now what the committee never had. Emma Richter was not a mystery to be solved. She was a boundary. A warning etched into time itself. Margaret closed her laptop. The next morning she went to the river. Fog clung low to the water, thick enough to erase the opposite bank. The air smelled of silt and something older. She stood at the edge, notebook in hand, and for the first time since arriving, she did not try to categorize what she felt. Emma, she said aloud, voice trembling. The fog shifted. Margaret did not see a girl step forward. She did not see a face or a form. What she felt instead was presence. The sense of standing near something patient and immense, something that had waited through decades without resentment. I won't take you apart, Margaret whispered. I won't turn you into proof. The fog thinned slightly as if the river had exhaled. Margaret opened her notebook and tore out every page she had written about the ledger, the letter, the deaths. She let the paper fall into the water, watched ink bleed and vanish. The counting slowed. When she returned to the motel, her room smelled normal again. The air felt ordinary. The night passed without interruption. Margaret left Franklin County 2 days later. She never published the paper. She never used Emma Richter's name in any lecture or book. When colleagues asked why she had abandoned such promising research, she smiled and said she had changed her focus. She specialized instead in absence, in the study of what records refused to hold. Years later, when her students asked why some stories disappear, Margaret answered carefully. Because not every truth is meant to be owned, she said. Some exist to remind us where we must stop. And sometimes, late at night, when she paused between thoughts, she felt it, the faintest rhythm, no longer counting her but acknowledging her. Time listening. And somewhere within it, unmeasured and unclaimed, Emma Richter remained exactly what she had always been. A warning that endured. After Margaret Lyle left Franklin County, the town resumed its practiced rhythm with the relief of people who believed danger could be outlived by silence. The Richter property changed hands twice within a decade. Each new owner promised improvement. Windows were widened. Floors replaced. The East Wing, where the fire had eaten paper and certainty alike, was rebuilt brighter than the rest of the house, as if light itself could disinfect memory. The cellar room beneath it was sealed completely, stone poured until no hollow remained. Officially, nothing unusual had ever happened there. Unofficially, the land resisted forgetting. Men working the fields complained of headaches that arrived before storms. Animals refused to cross certain patches of ground. Tools broke without reason. Watches stopped for minutes at a time and then resumed as if embarrassed. No one filed reports. In town, the name Emma Richter was not spoken anymore, not because it was forbidden but because it had become unnecessary. The story had condensed into something simpler and more dangerous. A feeling that some boundaries were enforced whether people believed in them or not. Children still sensed it first. They spoke of a girl by the river who never stepped closer, who never asked questions, who only watched. Parents corrected them sharply but never asked what the girl said. Some knowledge they had learned was safer unexamined. Doctors came and went through Franklin County as they always had. Most stayed only briefly. A few arrived with ambition sharpened by new instruments, new theories, new language that promised mastery. They noticed the same things. Patients who reacted before touch. Illnesses predicted hours too early. Accidents narrowly avoided without explanation. At first, curiosity stirred. Notes were taken. Hypotheses formed. Then something subtle shifted. A fire destroyed a single file cabinet. A flood ruined one specific shelf. A researcher woke from dreams where numbers pressed against his thoughts until sleep became impossible. The work stalled. The doctors left. No one connected the pattern because connection required naming, and naming required invitation. Years later, fragments surfaced in places that did not know what to do with them. A scorched ledger page in a private collection. A half-burned letter tucked into a family Bible. A margin note in an unrelated journal that read simply, "She was not wrong." Each fragment vanished again, quietly, often by accident. Misfiling. Fire. Historians noticed the gaps but explained them away. Reconstruction was chaotic. Records were fragile. Counties were careless. They did not ask why carelessness repeated itself so precisely. What none of them understood was that Emma Richter had never been an event. She was a response. She emerged where power mistook curiosity for entitlement, where observation became extraction, where a human life was reduced to a mechanism to be opened, tested, owned. The Committee of 1873 had believed they were pioneers. Time disagreed. Because long after Boone's death, long after the fire and the erasures, the consequence of that arrogance persisted, not as punishment but as correction. Emma did not haunt those who left her alone. She appeared only where men tried again. In the early 1950s, a government-funded study on predictive physiological response collapsed when its lead investigator resigned without explanation. He cited exhaustion. His colleagues noticed he never touched a pen again without flinching. In the 1970s, a university lab abandoned a promising line of inquiry after every data backup corrupted itself at the same timestamp. The technician joked about ghosts. The project ended anyway. In each case, the explanation was mundane. In each case, the result was the same. The work stopped. What survived was not proof, but restraint. People who listened learned quickly. Midwives trusted intuition. Laborers stepped aside before beams fell. Families left houses moments before fires broke out. They did not attribute these things to miracles. They called it sense. They called it luck. They did not call it Emma. And yet she remained. Not as a figure walking the riverbanks, not as a voice whispering doom, but as a presence woven into timing itself, the fraction of a second where choice exists before consequence. She was there in hesitation, in pauses, in the moment someone decided not to proceed. Emma Richter had not defeated science. She had exposed its limits. She had shown that knowledge pursued without humility collapses inward, consuming its own records. That not every phenomenon exists to be catalogued. That some truths are not puzzles but warnings. By the end of the 20th century, Franklin County had become unremarkable again. Tourists passed through without stopping. The river flowed as it always had, patient, indifferent. Only at dusk, when fog softened the world and sound carried strangely, did the old sensation return. The feeling of being measured, not judged, not threatened. Measured. Those who felt it quickest were the ones who stepped back. And those who stepped back lived without ever knowing how close they had come to repeating the past. Because Emma Richter did not seek recognition. She did not require belief. She existed where lines were crossed. And she endured because time itself had learned from her. There is a comfort people take in believing that stories like this end. A fire. A disappearance. A footnote sealed by age. But stories about boundaries never truly finish. They wait. Because long after Franklin County learned how to forget politely, long after Margaret Lyle learned how to listen without naming, the world continued doing what it has always done best, testing limits and calling it progress. In laboratories far from the Missouri River, men and women asked new versions of the same old questions. Could intuition be quantified? Could foresight be trained? Could human response outrun cause if properly stimulated? They used better machines, cleaner language, ethical review boards. They believed that difference mattered. And for a while nothing went wrong. Then the delays began. A sensor triggered before contact. A subject reacted before instruction. A system recorded data that no one remembered entering. At first, these were dismissed as calibration errors, statistical noise, software ghosts. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves to those patient enough to watch. A research assistant resigned suddenly, citing exhaustion without cause. A lead investigator abandoned a study after waking nightly at the same hour. A grant was quietly redirected when preliminary results refused to stabilize. No fires. No deaths. Just refusal. Time closing its hand. Because Emma Richter was never confined to one place, one century, one girl. She was what happens when observation forgets humility. She was what emerges when power mistakes access for permission. The men of 1873 believed knowledge justified intrusion. They believed that if something could be studied, it should be. That if a human being produced results, that human being could be reduced to process. Time corrected them, not with spectacle but with erasure. It removed their certainty first, then their records, then their legacy. And in doing so, it left behind something quieter and far more enduring, restraint. The restraint that makes someone hesitate before proceeding. The restraint that whispers not everything is yours to take. The restraint that lives in the space between impulse and action. That was Emma Richter's true inheritance. Not prophecy. Not supernatural power. But consequence arriving precisely when it was due. If you listen closely to history, not the headlines, not the monuments, but the gaps, you will find her there. In the winters where records vanish. In the studies that never conclude. in the questions abandoned just before answers harden into violations. She does not punish curiosity. She punishes arrogance. And she does not announce herself. She counts, slowly, impartially, without malice. She counts moments where restraint fails. She counts how many times warning is mistaken for invitation. She counts until the pattern corrects itself. That is why her story was buried. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was inconvenient. Because it suggested that some truths cannot be owned without cost. That some knowledge resists capture not out of mystery but out of refusal. That the most dangerous phrase is not "we don't know yet," but "we have the right to find out." Emma Richter was the answer history gave to that phrase. And history has been repeating it ever since. So now the question does not belong to doctors or committees or archivists. It belongs to you. What do you believe Emma Richter truly was? A supernatural force that defied explanation? A psychological phenomenon shaped by survival and oppression? Or a reminder that some boundaries exist whether we acknowledge them or not? Leave your interpretation in the comments below. If you want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories erased on purpose, voices buried by power, truths that resist being owned, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes history still has secrets worth listening to. These stories were silenced for a reason. They endured for a reason too. And somewhere, in the quiet space between moments, time is still listening. Slowly. Precisely. Counting.